I started noticing how small actions could carry enormous weight when wielded carefully. At networking events, I quietly offered guidance to mutual acquaintances who had previously leaned on my family for favors, never flaunting my success, but subtly proving my competence. They began to mention me in conversations, praising my insight, without my family ever realizing I was the one shaping those impressions. It was thrilling to see the respect I had earned ripple outward, affecting circles they assumed they controlled. Even at work, I took opportunities to exceed expectations, quietly taking credit in ways that didn't draw immediate attention, but created a trail of undeniable competence. Colleagues who once underestimated me now sought my advice, valuing my judgment in ways that made me invisible no longer. The satisfaction wasn't loud. It was in the quiet acknowledgement that my influence was spreading, growing stronger under their noses. I imagined my family at that moment, still assuming I struggled, still believing their narrative of superiority. The contrast between their perception and reality thrilled me, a secret power building patiently. Each small victory became a deliberate, almost invisible step toward a reckoning they hadn't anticipated. My mind raced with possibilities, plotting subtle reversals, imagining how it would feel to watch them finally recognize the depth of my success. Even as I moved through these spaces with quiet confidence, I never lost sight of the sting that had started it all. The exclusion, the dismissal, the silent message that I was less than. That memory kept my fire alive, fueling every careful decision. I wasn't just growing. I was preparing for a moment when the balance of power would shift entirely, and the family that had ignored me would finally have to reckon with who I had become. Even as I quietly carved my path, my family continued to dismiss me as if nothing I accomplished mattered. At professional gatherings, I spoke with authority and confidence, colleagues nodding in recognition. Yet I left the spotlight intentionally dim, knowing they were watching from afar and assuming I was struggling. The contrast between their assumptions and the reality of my life was intoxicating. They believed I was powerless, while I was steadily accumulating influence and respect. At a charity gala, I noticed my sibling flaunting connections I had long surpassed. I stayed calm, observing as key figures approached me for insight, my quiet competence shining without fanfare. They didn't see me, but the world outside them did, and that truth simmered quietly in the back of my mind. Each smile, each acknowledgement from someone they respected, felt like a small, secret victory, a breadcrumb trail proving I was no longer the overlooked sibling. Even family gatherings became stages of subtle tension. I attended a cousin's engagement party and watched them orchestrate conversations as if they were in control. Meanwhile, I navigated the room with ease, answering questions, offering guidance, and earning nods of admiration. All the while, they assumed I was the same person they had always underestimated, their ignorance only amplifying my satisfaction. With every understated triumph, the anticipation for a reckoning grew. I felt a quiet, patient thrill, knowing that the moment would come when they could no longer ignore the truth. The contrast between my rising power and their oblivion created an electric tension that pulsed through every interaction. I smiled politely, the fire of anticipation burning quietly beneath, ready for the day my silent victories would culminate in the moment they could no longer dismiss me. The turning point arrived unexpectedly, as these moments often do. I had just closed a deal that would define my career, a partnership with a company my family had always dismissed as unreachable, one they assumed I would never touch. When the contract landed on my desk, it wasn't just a business victory, it was a statement, a tangible proof of the skills and determination they had spent years ignoring. I held the signed papers in my hands, feeling the weight of every slight, every snide remark, every invisible shove that had led me here. For a moment, I allowed myself to savor the victory privately, knowing how explosive it would feel when revealed. I imagined the astonishment in their eyes when they learned that the quiet, supposedly struggling sibling had achieved what they had deemed impossible. My mind raced through countless scenarios, each one more satisfying than the last, and I realized that this wasn't just about success. It was about power, perception, and finally reclaiming the narrative. It was also deeply personal. I remembered my sibling's message forbidding me to attend Mom's birthday, the casual cruelty that had stung like acid. That exclusion had fueled years of patient preparation, And now the moment was approaching when restraint would transform into revelation. I felt a rush of controlled excitement, the kind that mixes nervous energy with the satisfaction of strategy unfolding perfectly. I began to plan meticulously. When I would step back into their world, how I would reveal what I had built quietly, and how I could ensure that their assumptions about me would crumble in a single, undeniable moment. For the first time in years, I felt fully in control, no longer overlooked, no longer dismissed. I was ready to assert my presence in a way that would leave them breathless. And in doing so, I knew that the balance of power in our family was about to change forever. The day of the next family gathering, I arrived early, parking a few blocks away to gather myself before stepping inside. I walked in with a calm composure, deliberately understated, carrying nothing that would immediately reveal the successes I had quietly amassed. My presence was deliberate yet subtle, an almost invisible assertion of confidence. I could feel eyes flicker toward me as I entered, the usual assumptions about my insignificance suddenly uncertain. There was a pause, a hesitation, and I smiled inwardly, savoring the tiny disruption my mere presence had created. As I mingled, I caught glimpses of my siblings' discomfort. They whispered, glanced, and tried to maintain control, but the uncertainty in their eyes betrayed them. I remembered the words that had once excluded me, the casual dismissal, and now the tables were quietly turning. With each conversation, I measured my tone, the ease of my laughter, the clarity of my contributions. Knowing they were silently recalibrating their assumptions about me, I let the moment stretch, prolonging the tension. It was intoxicating to feel the subtle shift in power without overtly announcing it. My internal monologue raced with anticipation, envisioning how their incredulity would eventually give way to acknowledgement. I felt a thrill in the restrained control, knowing the payoff would come in its own time. Patience had always been my ally. And now, as I stood among them, calm and assured, I realized that just by being there, I was rewriting the story they had always told about me. I moved through the room, exchanging polite smiles and small talk, but my attention was keenly focused on the undercurrent of conversations around me. At one point, a distant cousin mentioned a project I had spearheaded at work, praising its scope and impact without realizing I was standing just a few feet away. I allowed the comment to linger, smiling faintly to myself as I listened to people recount my accomplishments. The realization on their faces, slow and hesitant, was like a current of satisfaction running through me. Later, as I reached for a drink, my designer watch caught the light, subtly drawing attention without being overt. Eyes flickered. Whispers began. I could feel my siblings' unease, their mind racing to reconcile the quiet figure before them with the achievements they had assumed were beyond me. Each glance and hushed remark hit with a delicious mix of FOMO and subtle admiration. They were starting to see the reality I had built outside their awareness. I let the tension build, savoring the emotional contrast. The same family who had once dismissed my efforts was now confronted, slowly and silently, with undeniable proof of my competence, influence, and success. I felt a quiet, almost private thrill, a satisfaction that wasn't loud but powerful. In that room, their assumptions began to crumble, replaced with curiosity, doubt, and the first seeds of respect. And in that moment, I knew the path toward the ultimate revelation had begun. I was no longer the overlooked sibling. I was becoming the force they had underestimated. I stared at my phone, the screen glaring back at me with words I didn't want to see. "Don't come. You'll ruin Mom's birthday." Just like that, a single message managed to twist my stomach into knots I hadn't felt in years. My hands shook slightly as I reread it, hoping maybe I had imagined the coldness behind those words. But no, it was deliberate. My sibling didn't just exclude me. They framed it as if I were the problem, as if my very presence was a threat to a celebration that was supposed to be about love. It was humiliating, but more than that, it was familiar. I remembered the Christmases where my gifts were dismissed in favor of theirs, the graduations where applause seemed reserved for them, the casual remarks that implied I was never enough. I tried to shake it off, but every memory came rushing back in a flood of bitterness and frustration. They didn't even have the decency to explain. It was assumed I'd comply silently, as always. As I sat there, the room feeling smaller with each passing second, I realized this was the same pattern repeating itself. Favoritism disguised as care, betrayal wrapped in family obligation. I was the child who didn't belong in their narrative, the shadow at the edges of every photograph, the one whose accomplishments were minimized or ignored. The message felt like a confirmation of everything I had already known, but it also sparked something deeper, a mix of anger and a quiet determination I hadn't dared to acknowledge before. I wanted to respond, to fight back, to demand my place, but I knew better than to react in anger. Silence had been my shield for so long, and though it burned to remain unseen, it also allowed me to observe, to strategize, to imagine a moment when the power dynamics would shift, when I could stand in that room, not just present but undeniable. I tucked my phone away and let the words linger, a cold reminder of how low they expected me to sink. But for the first time in years, I didn't feel small. I felt patient, and I felt quietly, fiercely alive. I parked a few streets away, pretending to be busy on my phone, though every message I typed went unsent. Through the tinted window, I could see the house bustling with laughter, the flicker of candles on a birthday cake, and my family gathered as if I didn't exist. My chest tightened with a mixture of longing and rage. They were celebrating Mom, but they were also celebrating the narrative in which I had no place. Each laugh felt like a tiny jab, a reminder that I had been deliberately written out of this moment. I watched my sibling hover near Mom, whispering in her ear and making her smile in a way I hadn't seen directed at me in years. The sight ignited that familiar sting of exclusion, the gnawing realization that no matter how much I achieved or endured, I was still treated as an afterthought. I felt the weight of all those family dinners where my accomplishments were minimized, every unsolicited comparison to them echoing in my mind. And yet, sitting there, invisible but fully aware, I also felt a spark of something else, a small, rebellious satisfaction that they didn't know I was watching, that I was not participating in the scene they had orchestrated to belittle me. My thoughts wandered to the birthdays I had spent alone, to the times my advice was ignored, my efforts overlooked, my presence diminished. I imagined how they would react if they realized I had been observing silently, absorbing every detail while remaining untouchable. The contrast between their jovial ignorance and my controlled, simmering awareness made my pulse quicken. I felt empathy for myself, the self that had been dismissed so many times and yet also a cold, calculating patience for the moment when things would shift. I allowed myself to feel the hurt fully, the unfairness of it, the isolation, but I refused to let it dictate my actions. I was learning, as I had many times before, that sometimes the strongest response was restraint and the quiet accumulation of power and awareness. So I stayed parked, distant, and painfully present in my own mind, letting the night stretch out around them while I plotted quietly for a future where they would finally recognize my worth. As I sat in the car, the sounds of laughter behind the walls of that house triggered a cascade of memories I hadn't let myself revisit in years. I remembered my 16th birthday, the cake adorned with my siblings' favorite colors while mine had been an afterthought, a small corner with a poorly lit candle. The look on my parents' faces had said it all. Excitement for them, mild tolerance for me. I had tried to smile, to feel gratitude, but the sting of invisibility had been sharp, immediate, and enduring. Graduation day hadn't been much different. While my siblings' achievements were showcased in pictures and social media posts, mine were glossed over in passing conversation. The words, "good job," muttered with a shrug. Even my closest friends had noticed the disparity, asking why I seemed to fade into the background whenever family gatherings were discussed. The pattern was consistent. Favoritism, dismissals, and comparisons that subtly communicated that I was always a step behind in their eyes. Then there were the small, cruel moments disguised as jokes. Comments about my clothes being cheap, remarks about my modest accomplishments, and snide suggestions that I should be grateful for what little I had achieved. They treated status like a hierarchy I could never climb, as though wealth, charisma, and charm were things I could never embody, and I was forever meant to play the supporting role in their family narrative. Those memories combined into a slow, burning anger, a mixture of sadness, humiliation, and a yearning for vindication I had long buried. Even the holidays carried their own subtle punishments. Hand-me-down gifts, overlooked birthdays, and whispered praises for my sibling that never reached me. I had been taught to endure, to smile politely, to internalize the sense that I didn't belong at the top of anyone's attention or admiration. Sitting there, watching them from afar, I felt the weight of all those years pressing down on me. Each incident reinforcing a truth I had known but seldom acknowledged aloud. I had been underestimated, dismissed, and written off time and time again. And now, finally, I was beginning to imagine the moment when that dynamic would irrevocably change. After that night, I threw myself into my work with a single-minded intensity I hadn't known I possessed. Every morning, I reminded myself of the sting I had felt sitting outside their house, invisible and dismissed, and I let it fuel me rather than break me. I studied harder, networked strategically, and sought opportunities that would quietly accumulate into undeniable success. Each small victory, a promotion, a contract signed, a project praised, felt like a brick added to the fortress I was building around my self-worth. I bought my first luxury watch not for show, but as a quiet reminder to myself that I was capable of achieving what they had always assumed I could not. Invitations to exclusive events began arriving, and I attended with the same subtle confidence I had cultivated over years of being underestimated. The recognition felt surreal at times, and yet I kept it understated, like a secret power gathering quietly in the shadows. Every day, I measured my rise against the backdrop of their ignorance. They still assumed I struggled, that I would remain the overlooked sibling, but each achievement was a silent victory. I imagined their faces if they realized I was now operating on a completely different plane, wealth, influence, and credibility growing, while they remained wrapped in their comfortable assumptions of my inferiority. Even as I enjoyed my progress, I reminded myself that the true impact wouldn't be immediate or loud. I needed patience. Observing, planning, and positioning myself carefully would be far more satisfying than any overt confrontation. I was no longer just the overlooked sibling. I was becoming someone who could quietly reshape the dynamics, who could flip the power imbalance on its head without them even realizing it was happening. And for the first time in a long time, I felt the intoxicating mix of pride and anticipation. A quiet thrill at knowing that the story was no longer theirs to control. My sibling finally cornered me near the edge of the room, their voice low but sharp. "I didn't expect you to be here like this," they said, a mix of disbelief and defensiveness. I met their gaze calmly, letting the silence stretch, letting them fumble for words as they tried to regain control. "I'm just here," I said softly, "enjoying the party like everyone else." The understatement in my tone seemed to rattle them more than any accusation ever could. They pressed, questioning achievements I had quietly built over months, incredulous at the people I had influenced and the doors I had opened. I let them speak, nodding in acknowledgement, occasionally offering concise explanations that highlighted competence without arrogance. Each word they stumbled over felt like a small victory. Each pause in their argument, a crack in the wall of their assumptions. Internally, I reflected on years of being dismissed, holidays where I was ignored, milestones minimized, and accomplishments treated as irrelevant. The sting of those moments had driven me to this point. Now, as I navigated this tense dialogue, I felt a quiet empowerment. I had anticipated this confrontation, prepared for it, and yet the satisfaction of seeing them struggle to process the reality of my success was almost intoxicating. I realized the contrast between past and present, the overlooked, ridiculed, sibling versus the composed, capable present standing before them. My anger had transformed into controlled strength. My hurt had become a quiet force of assertion. And as the conversation lingered, their uncertainty became my signal. The next step in this quiet revolution was close. The balance of power was shifting, and I could feel the moment approaching when my patience and strategy would fully pay off. The moment arrived sooner than I had expected, but I had been ready. As the dinner progressed, a mutual acquaintance I had quietly mentored approached the group, unknowingly setting the stage for the revelation. They began recounting a recent project I had led, a venture that had transformed the company, earned accolades in the industry, and placed me in a position of influence my family had always assumed I would never reach. I let them speak, nodding politely, as my sibling's face went from casual dismissal to disbelief, the words finally sinking in. Gasps and murmurs followed as more examples of my accomplishments spilled into the room. From the quiet partnerships I had formed to the charitable initiatives I had funded without fanfare, every detail landed like a carefully aimed arrow. My siblings' attempts to interject were feeble, overshadowed by the undeniable reality of my success. For the first time, their assumptions about my capabilities were shattered. I watched their expressions twist with confusion, embarrassment, and a dawning understanding that the sibling they had dismissed for years had quietly become a force beyond their control. I felt a wave of satisfaction, not from cruelty, but from the validation of perseverance and patience. Years of being underestimated, ignored, and excluded culminated in this single, undeniable moment of recognition. My family had no choice but to confront the truth. I had achieved what they believed impossible, and I had done it on my own terms. Their social superiority, the narrative they had clung to, crumbled quietly but completely before the evidence of my independence and influence. Even my parents, who had always tried to remain neutral, looked stunned. The careful balance of status, favoritism, and expectation had tipped irrevocably. My siblings' usual smugness faltered, replaced by a hesitant acknowledgement of reality. The emotional payoff was electric. The years of frustration, humiliation, and invisibility finally found closure. I realized that the most satisfying revenge didn't come from confrontation or anger. It came from being undeniably, effortlessly victorious while maintaining composure. And as the murmurs settled into whispers of awe and quiet respect, I allowed myself a deep breath, savoring the catharsis. This was the moment I had envisioned for so long, a revelation that delivered justice not through spectacle, but through undeniable truth. In their astonishment, I saw every slight, every dismissal, every exclusion reflected back at them. I had not just arrived, I had ascended, quietly, powerfully, and irrevocably. The balance had shifted, and it was permanent. After the revelation settled over the room, a heavy silence took hold. I watched as my family processed what had just unfolded. The shock, the disbelief, and the flickers of regret crossing faces that had once seemed so confident in their assumptions. My siblings' usual arrogance was gone, replaced with hesitation, and a cautious attempt to gauge how far I had really come. I could see the internal struggle in their eyes, part envy, part recognition, part guilt. My parents, too, seemed caught between pride and confusion. They asked tentative questions, trying to reconcile the child they had always assumed was secondary with the accomplished adult standing before them. The weight of years of favoritism, comparisons, and quiet dismissals hung in the air, but I didn't need to fill it with explanations. My presence, calm and composed, said more than any words could. I allowed them space to react, listening to their stammered attempts at conversation, their awkward compliments, and the hesitant acknowledgement of my achievements. Each response, flawed as it was, reinforced the growth I had worked so hard to cultivate. I felt a quiet pride in my restraint, in the dignity I maintained even as they scrambled to comprehend the truth. Internally, I reflected on how far I had come from the overlooked, dismissed sibling to the one who now commanded respect effortlessly. The power dynamics had shifted, but the satisfaction was not rooted in vengeance. It was in the affirmation of my own perseverance, composure, and worth. I didn't need to gloat or argue. Standing tall amidst their reactions, I realized that inner strength and grace could speak louder than confrontation ever could. As the evening wound down, I found a quiet moment to reflect on everything that had brought me here. The sting of exclusion, the dismissals, the favoritism I had endured. All of it had shaped me in ways I hadn't fully appreciated until now. I realized that my true victory wasn't just in proving my family wrong or showcasing my achievements. It was in the resilience, patience, and strategic thinking I had cultivated along the way. Every slight had been a lesson. Every underestimate, a push toward growth I could never have achieved otherwise. I thought about my sibling, their disbelief slowly giving way to grudging respect, and even my parents, whose hesitant pride reminded me that family dynamics are rarely simple. The quiet victories mattered more than the loud celebrations. They reflected not only my success, but the moral satisfaction of rising without compromising my values. I had learned that empowerment doesn't require spectacle. It thrives in patience, persistence, and the strength to remain composed while others scramble to catch up. There was a profound sense of release in knowing that I had rewritten my narrative. I wasn't the overlooked child anymore. I was the architect of my own life, the author of my own story. The emotional satisfaction wasn't just personal, it was cathartic, a testament to the power of dignity, restraint, and strategic action. As I looked around the room one last time, I felt an inner calm and a quiet triumph. This was justice delivered not through vengeance, but through undeniable, elegant success. Looking back on everything, I realized that the journey wasn't just about proving my family wrong. It was about proving to myself that I mattered, that my worth was never defined by their approval or recognition. Every dismissal, every slight, every moment of being overlooked became a stepping stone, shaping the resilience I carry today. I learned that true power isn't about shouting your achievements. It's about cultivating strength quietly, letting actions speak where words cannot. Life will often place us in situations where we feel invisible or underestimated, especially by those we love most. I want you to understand that those moments, as painful as they are, can be transformative. The sting of betrayal can sharpen your focus, fuel your determination, and teach you patience you never knew you had. Justice isn't always immediate, and revenge isn't always dramatic. Sometimes it's subtle, elegant, and profoundly satisfying. I also realized that self-worth cannot be borrowed or imposed by others. It must be built, protected, and quietly celebrated. Standing tall in the face of doubt, walking away from their assumptions without anger, and allowing your accomplishments to speak for themselves is a victory that no one can take away. It's the kind of empowerment that leaves a lasting impact, not just on your own life, but on the perceptions of those who once underestimated you. So, to anyone who has ever been dismissed, overlooked, or made to feel small, your journey isn't over. Let patience, strategy, and self-belief guide you. Build quietly, rise steadily, and one day, the truth of your strength will speak louder than their words ever could. That is the catharsis, the justice, and the freedom that comes from understanding your worth. And no one can ever take it from you.